Joe Lisi would go for the 2.com, continuing my week one analysis of some of the great matchups this upcoming college football season. Going to turn my attention to a great battle taking place in Alabama, Clemson and Auburn. Clemson's won the last two meetings by an average margin of victory of 10.5 points per game. They've outscored the Tigers by a total score of 64-43 in the last two meetings. When you look at Clemson from an offensive perspective in 2015, what can you say but dynamic and explosive? This is a team that averaged 38 points per game but had a very balanced attack. They rushed for 223 yards on the ground and passed for 291 yards through the air against opposing defenses. They'll be led by junior quarterback Deshaun Watson. He's a Heisman Trophy frontrunner entering the 2016 season. Last year, he completed 67% of his passes for 4,104 yards, 35 passing touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. Watson also rushed for 1,105 yards, averaging 5.5 yards per carry, and did have 12 rushing touchdowns in 2015. Clemson also brings back explosive running back Wayne Gallman, who led the team in rushing with 1,527 yards. He averaged over 5 yards per carry and did have 13 rushing touchdowns in 2015. Clemson also likes to utilize Gallman in the short to intermediate passing game, which could put a lot of pressure on opposing defenses in the upcoming season. When you look at Clemson overall, they had 11 straight games where the offense averaged over 500 yards of total offense. In the 15 games by Clemson, in 11 of those contests, Clemson rushed for over 200 yards per game. In 13 of the 15 games, Clemson completed over 60% of their passes. The only two games that Clemson did not complete over 60% of their passes was in the victory at home against Notre Dame and in the playoff win over the Oklahoma Sooners. From a defensive perspective, Clemson allowed 21 points per game, but they were very solid in run support, only giving up 125 yards on the ground, and they only gave up 187 passing yards per game in 2015. This was a defense that recorded 48 total sacks, held opposing offenses to only 27% conversion rate on third downs, and in 8 of the 15 contests last year, Clemson held opposing quarterbacks to under 43% completion percentage. Last year, Kevin Dodd and Shaq Lawson accounted for 50% of the sack production last year. That's going to be a statistic that the Tigers have to make up in the 2016 season. When you look at overall, they also lose Mackenzie Alexander, who led the team in terms of being the shutdown corner. How will that affect the defense entering the 2015 season remains to be seen. When you look at the Tigers from a run perspective, defensively, they held their opponents to under 150 yards rushing in 10 of the 15 ball games. So that's going to be a key statistic as they go up against a run-heavy offense in the Auburn Tigers. When you look at Auburn overall in 2015, they had 6 losses that came to opponents with a combined record of 59-19 overall. Offensively, Auburn averaged 27 points per game. They rushed for 196 yards on the ground and passed for 173 yards through the air. But the 196 yards rushing per game was the lowest since prior to 2013. This is an offense that has gotten considerably worse running the football. In 2013, under Gus Malzahn, the Tigers averaged 328 yards per game. In 2014, the offense averaged 255 yards per game. Last year, they were under 200 yards per game at 196. But more importantly, in the 6 losses, Auburn's offense averaged only 158 yards on the ground. That was 38 yards less than their season average. That statistic has to change if the Tigers are going to have success in the upcoming season. The lack of rushing attack put a lot of pressure on the offensive line and put a lot of pressure on the quarterbacks, both Sean White and Jeremy Johnson, who combined for 11 passing touchdowns and 11 interceptions in 2015. When you look at passing offense for Auburn, last year they only had 1 game where they passed for over 300 yards of offense. That came in the loss at home to Ole Miss. In 8 of the Tigers' 13 games, they passed for under 171 yards per game. That statistic needs to change this upcoming season if the Tigers are going to make an SEC West run. From a defensive perspective, Auburn allowed 182 yards per game on the ground and gave up 222 passing yards through the air. This was a defense that allowed 26 points per game. More importantly, in the Tigers' 6 losses, Auburn allowed 211 yards on the ground. That was considerably higher in the Tigers' 6 losses than their season average. So that's a glaring statistic that you have to keep an eye out for entering this game against Clemson. When you look at turnovers, Auburn finished the year at a +2 margin, but they did have 14 interceptions as a secondary last year. A weakness for this defense, especially entering the 2016 season, is sack total. This was a team that only recorded 19 total sacks in 2015, which ranked 104th out of 127 teams. We're just getting started. I'm going to break this game down a little bit greater in deeper detail as we get closer to the season. Stay with me all season long on GoForThe2.com.